Hi, so today's video is going to discuss the idea of disability and take a few minutes to identify what is disability. So I'm going to start, and in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to try to answer what is disability. But just to start, I'll share that this image is a picture of my son. He's probably about 10 in this picture, and he's with our caregiver, Carol, at a petting zoo. And what you can't see and what's kind of funny is that he's petting a goat, but there's a second goat behind the wheelchair eating his feeding tube, which created lots of challenges that afternoon. So, disability, as we're going to quickly see, is not this uniform idea. It's not a singular state of being. It's not something we can just simply say disability is and give a quick and easy definition. Rather, it's this fairly complex and multifaceted way of being in the world. And it can include many different types of disabilities. So we may have acquired disabilities, so disabilities that happen later in life linked to trauma or illness, congenital disabilities, so disabilities that an individual may be born with, physical and intellectual disabilities, mental health challenges, but disabilities can also be temporary, permanent, or age-related. So a temporary disability might be a disability related to an injury or perhaps an illness. A permanent disability is obviously a disability that someone has that they will have for the rest of their life. Um, and then an age-related disability is often a disability that we acquire as we get older. We also complicate it, or disability is also complicated by intersectionality, which reminds us that we are not defined by one thing and that other demographics exist in combination to make our lives and our stories quite complex. So disability is not one way of being, but usually is combined with things like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and so on. And these complicate the conversation and complicate the experience of disability. So again, the experience of having a disability is not defined by one thing, but is impacted by these other demographics. The World Health Organization has noted that our understanding of disability over the years has shifted from a primarily medical orientation to include a social aspect as well. However, what I appreciate about the World Health Organization definition is that it actually takes a balanced approach and considers both medical and social factors. The social model of disability identifies that the barriers to participation for people with disabilities emerge mostly not from the body, but from barriers in the environment. And these barriers can be physical, environmental, financial, and attitudinal. So a physical barrier would be stairs where there perhaps could be a ramp, so someone in a wheelchair could get up, get up the flight of stairs, or to get from one sort of floor to another. They can be attitudinal, so discrimination, refusal to hire people with disabilities, and assumptions they can't do a job. Financial barriers, so the reality that people with disabilities often live in poverty because they have poor supports. And that ultimately the experience of being disabled is equivalent to the experience of being discriminated against. Ableism is similar to other isms such as racism and sexism. It's a form of discrimination. And again, it identifies that barriers are linked to stigma and discrimination that is embedded in the environment. And it often is linked to stereotypes that assumes that people with disabilities aren't able to manage their lives. They are saints or superheroes, or conversely, are asexual, tragic, childlike, or dependent. So again, if we think about this theme of stories we keep coming back to, stereotypes are stories that society has created that are often untrue about people with disabilities. The medical model is a model linked to functional performance. And again, it links to this idea that we've talked about, um, that is, of being sort of this idea that there is a normal body. And the medical model assumes that there is a typical or normal body, and that functional losses, physical, intellectual, and so on, are deviations from normal, and they are very much located within the individual. So it de emphasizes the role of society, and it emphasizes these differences within the body. And within the medical model, strategies for people with disabilities emphasize improving functional abilities within the body rather than addressing the barriers within the environment. So again, it emphasizes the body and the individual rather than what might be happening in the environment. Whereas the biopsychosocial model, the more balanced approach by the World Health Organization, actually takes ideas from both the social model of disability and the medical model of disability. And it accepts the reality that there are numerous barriers to participation that exist within the environment. But it also agrees with this idea that sometimes the body itself is a source of limitation. And so it blends this idea of embodied um, differences that impact performance and barriers within the environment that significantly impact performance or the ability to engage in activities. A few key definitions that are important and are defined by the World Health Organization, and that is this idea of impairment, which is some sort of difference within the body, such as blindness or paralysis. The body is somehow functionally different than what is seen as typical. An activity limitation then is this translation to a difficulty doing or performing a specific activity. So if you have or you experience paralysis, then you will have difficulty doing something like walking. A participation restriction, though, is a barrier in areas of life, in any area of life, that is usually linked to discrimination. So while you may not be able to walk because of paralysis, the reason you can't get into a building isn't because you cannot walk, but because there isn't a ramp or an elevator or a lift or some way to get into the building for those people who cannot physically climb the stairs. Something that I'm very interested in, so I wanted to just take a moment and share this, is this idea of the postmodern body, which I find really compelling. And this offers a new way to consider bodies, including people with disabilities or bodies with disabilities. And the postmodern body thinks about this way of being that the body is more complicated. It's interdependent. In fact, bodies are leaky, so that my experience and another individual's experience may actually leak into each other and inform each other. It embraces this idea of, say, a cyborg body. So, this idea that things become part of our body. So, think about it. My son's wheelchair becomes part of his body, his feeding tube becomes part of his body. My glasses are part of his body. A philosopher by the name of Merleau-Ponty talks about this idea of a white cane becoming some part of the sensory experience of the body of someone with a visual impairment. So the white cane becomes their fingertips. And that these intermingled experiences and bodies inform each other. And one of the themes within the postmodern body is that for some bodies with disabilities, additional bodies become part of their embodiment. So with my son's case, because he has significant disabilities, my body, his caregiver's body, became part of his body. I became his voice in some experiences. Or a seeing eye dog, another body becomes a part of the body for someone with a visual impairment. It's a very interesting and emergent model, and there is some ambivalence or tension around this body, this vision of the body. Not all communities accept this, particularly the medical community. One final way of defining disability that I'd like to discuss is proposed by Deborah Kramer, who is a theologian who writes about disability. And she talks about this idea of a limits model. And what is appealing about this as that she or about her model is that she notes that being limited, that experiencing limitations is a global experience. It's something we all experience. And as a result, we are all in some ways dependent. No one is completely independent. And this idea of interdependence, of needing other bodies to assist, is actually fairly universal. So, and I believe it's a theme that came up with the Bianis when they were here talking about the Ubuntu philosophy. And the appeal of the Kramer's model is that it doesn't dismiss the medical or the social models, but encourages a conversation around these issues between the embodiment of disability, the social impact of disability, and this idea of being interdependent within society. So, as we can see, disability is a fairly complicated way of being a body in the world that is impacted by many different ways of viewing it. And I'm hopeful that in our class we'll spend time further talking about this.